Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Thomas DeAngelis, and I am I'm a research associate at the Create Centre. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today for another instalment in Create's series of webinars. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Gadigal land in the sunny Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today, we're joined by Jeff M. Poulin, who will be delivering a presentation that we've been waiting for some time. But there's been quite a bit of hype around the Create Centre around Jeff's presentation, and it's our great pleasure to welcome him today. Jeff actually has spent his life, his entire life in the arts. I was reading recently that he began a very illustrious career in tap shoes at the age of 2, working as a performer, choreographer, and master teacher for local studios and national companies around the United States. He now primarily, aside from the tapping, works as an educationalist, cultural administrator, and social entrepreneur whose work is grounded in social justice and seeks transformative local solutions to complex global challenges. Today, he joins us to present his webinar, Centering Creative Youth in Community Development, and it's our great pleasure to welcome him to this forum. So thank you very much, Jeff, and welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen here briefly. All right, so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about a project that I completed in 2020 and has continued to develop over the last few years called Centering Creative Youth in Community Development. What I hope to share with you over the course of the next hour or so is some urgent framing of support for socially engaged creative young people. I hope that we can explore the impacts that young creatives believe that they have on their communities, and to finally imagine the possible roles of adult allies of young people in cultivating creativity for social transformation. I too would like to acknowledge, on behalf of Creative Generation, the organization whom I work with, we recognize and uplift and express gratitude for 3 groups of people whom form the foundation that we stand upon today: the elders, the caretakers, and the global majority. We acknowledge, give thanks, and pay respect to these peoples. And today I recognize the Piscataway and the Anacostan nations on whose territory that I work and live, and all of the indigenous peoples whose lands that I traverse in the course of my work. I pay respect to these leaders, past, present, and as the future caretakers of that land. I hope to share with you a little bit about my story, which was just alluded to. As you heard, I began in the arts as probably all of us did. I followed my older sister into a dance studio when I was just 2.5 years old. That dance routine was called How Much Is That Doggy in the Window? And you guessed it, I was the doggy. No, I no longer have those sequin suspenders, but the legacy of tap dance in my life did remain. By the time I was in high school, I had landed my first national tour and had an unconventional high school experience traveling the country, doing residencies and master classes in schools around the United States, where I saw firsthand that not every kid had the opportunities in the arts that I did. Not every school was like my school, and not every community was like the one that I grew up in, which invested wholeheartedly in arts and culture. This fueled a passion in me where I got involved in student government and leadership and advocacy initiatives, both in and outside of the arts. In fact, I rose to statewide positions within political parties and advocacy organizations. You see here on the right-hand side a moment where I put to work my performing arts training, leading activities to build advocacy capacities in young people before visiting our state legislature to advocate for education reform. Realizing that the skills I gained in the arts went far beyond the stage, but instead could help influence the changes that I wanted to see in the future world that I would live in. And so I got to work founding a nonprofit arts organization, seeking to use our creativity as intergenerational artists to bring attention to causes we care deeply about. And then I went to college. I found the world of arts management, which led me to New York City, to Dublin, Ireland, and eventually working on issues of cultural policy to fuse together that passion for social change and public policy development with my deep respect and gratitude for the arts. I was able to contribute to the development of public policies and their implementation in the Republic of Ireland, and eventually back home in Washington, D.C., where I served as the chief advocate for arts education at our nation's leading arts advocacy organization, championing in-school and out-of-school time policies, culminating in the signing of the Every Student Succeeds Act, with its 12 arts-friendly provisions by President Obama. In this time, I realized that there was a power in the arts, one that was so very different than what we often talked about, that reached far beyond artistic practice, but deep into the worlds of creativity, and that we needed to train the next generation of leaders. So in 2019, I left the advocacy world and began teaching and joined the faculties of arts management at Carnegie Mellon University and American University, and founded Creative Generation. We're a values-forward global collective that collaborates with young creatives and those who cultivate their creativity to take local actions towards global changes in pursuit of a more just world. You see in this photo the collection of artists, educators, researchers, storytellers, administrators, and activists gathered here actually in my hometown in Frederick, Maryland, to bring together our strengths from around the world to activate young people, projects, and their adult allies to create the changes that we want to see in our sector. So what is the Creative Generation, our namesake, you might ask? I'd like to share with you a little bit of the underpinning research that founds the ground that we stand on. As we all know, arts education is a fundamental civil and human right, tracing its roots back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The right to culture and its expression has been codified in international doctrine since the 1950s. And more so for young people in 1989 with the adoption of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, enumerating the specific rights of cultural expression, creative learning, and artistic freedom for young people. Further, throughout our history, we've written policies and guiding documents that have made the arts an essential part of our public policy systems in education and cultural funding. And in the United States, this really reached a pinnacle in the early 2000s when it was brought into our federal legislation as part of the No Child Left Behind Act and further the Every Student Succeeds Act. And more recently, under the Obama administration, scaled nationally to ensure the right to creative expression and cultural learning for every young person in every school nationwide. However, we haven't been really great about holding to those promises. Promises made, but not necessarily promises kept. And there's more work to largely be done. More recently, beginning in 2019, there's been a movement towards the application of creativity for social good. Some of us, including those on this call, were present in Frankfurt when the global arts education community declared in the Frankfurt Declaration that we recognize the role of the arts as part of a young person's right to expression and their right to drive social change. And this movement has continued with recognition through PISA and other organizations in Latin America, operating on a supranational level. And hopefully, just hopefully in December, will culminate with the adoption of the 2023 framework for culture and arts education by the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. I share all of this to draw lineage back to the human rights approach that we can take for arts education and forward to how we can see creativity applied in school, out of school, and within communities with a futures orientation. For me, that futures orientation dates back actually to March 24th in 2018. I stood in my apartment in Washington, D.C., watching on the TV, CNN. They were running a story about a march on Washington. In fact, it was one of the largest marches on Washington since the time of Martin Luther King. And it was led by young people, not just young people, actually, young creatives, theater makers, musicians, visual artists, the granddaughter of Martin Luther King herself. They took to the stage in front of our nation's capital and presented their songs and theatrical works, visual aids projected on the screens, using their artistic skills to project messages about what their vision was for the world, one that was free from gun violence and where schools were safe. And in this moment, they drove a national dialogue about gun violence and school safety, changing public policies and public discourse. But previously, I had been touring the country, meeting with governors and legislators, even the President of the United States, talking about the benefits of arts education, how we could lower dropout rates or raise test scores, why we needed to invest in public education and cultural funding in order to achieve these goals that were determined by our lawmakers and public funders. But what I realized in that moment is there was a bigger story out there. These young people, what they were doing, that was the outcome of arts education, not raised test scores. I actually don't care about standardized tests. What I care about is driving discourse to change the world. And so I brought that back to my own scholarship and began a 4-phase research process, one where we described the work in arts and cultural education and its outcomes, where we interrogated how artists, educators, and community activists were cultivating creative capabilities in young people, what the support for those young people, those adult allies looked like, and how we could navigate those systems. And finally, what we spent the last 5 years doing is thinking about how we can shift the pedagogies, organizational practices, public policies, and leadership pathways in order to better cultivate creativity and ultimately to catalyze creative social transformation. In our early findings, we found that the vast majority of literature about arts education proclaimed the benefits, aligning with the language of those decision makers, like funders or educational policy wonks. Mostly they were talking about lowering dropout rates or raising test scores or aligning success to attendance and completion of college, which, as we know, working with young people aren't actual indicators of lifelong success at all. In fact, when we convened focus groups of arts education leaders around the nation, we found that these were only demonstrative correlative narratives, that it wasn't what was actually happening in these programs, and that there was a desire to rewrite these narratives for better. And what we learned in this process through focus groups all around the United States is that words matter and how we describe our work matters. In fact, if you go back to resources in educational psychology, it shows that as an educator, if we describe our work in one way, but implement it a different way in an inharmonious fashion, we actually see detriment to the outcomes with young people. So we are actually better if we describe our work in the ways that we do our work and give up appealing to those decision makers. In this research, we found that our field actually struggles to articulate our work and its impact. We often use antiquated language and rationale. That because of that, we suffer from severe isolationism, lacking meaningful communities of practice. When we don't have the words, we can't find our peers. And ultimately, that leads to a lack of mechanisms to share knowledge and strong practices. And we deal in stagnated pedagogies and approaches. And ultimately, our field wants new shared measures of success to determine the short and long-term impacts of our aggregate work in the lives of young people and in communities. So we put forward a new definition, an approach to defining the work and its outcomes. What we found from people all around the nation was the language of social transformation, which refers to the processes of change and institutionalized relationships and norms and values and hierarchies over time. It often comes from within individuals, communities, and societies. This is what we saw with the March for Our Lives, with those young creatives in Washington, D.C. They're working from within to change the power dynamics of their nation. What we also found is that creative social transformation is what works best. There's study after study about the value of being creative in this work. But what is creative? We put forward the language of the creative generation, or Gen C for short, which is actually a term that comes from consumer arts marketing, used to sell tickets. But ultimately, what it describes is an intergenerational group of people no longer talking about Gen X, Gen Y, Boomer, etc., but instead this group of people ages 8 to 80, the authors say, that share common creative capabilities. That term capabilities finds its roots in the work of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum as aptitudes that we continue to develop over time. They're never quite finished. Those creative capabilities are creative thinking, cultural consciousness, connectivity, and what we called early on a concern for community, or what we call now citizenship. And we'd argue that this creative generation is uniquely positioned to employ their creative capabilities to catalyze this creative social transformation. We went back to the literature and found lots of research on this and different definitions, and each of them have polls that lead us to better understand how to both cultivate and expand those creative capabilities in young people and artists and creatives of all types. In fact, we actually found that artists and educators and community organizations were leading programs where they applied creativity. They worked in the abstract and the grounded through inquiry and meaning making to move through processes that both cultivated and applied creativity towards other objectives. It was no longer good enough to learn an instrument or to perform rehearsed choreography. In fact, what we actually seek with creativity in young people is the application to other aspects of their lives, particularly around social issues. And to make this happen, organizations were traversing new paths. They were viewing their work as not only cultural, but instead civic in nature. And they were deeply integrating their artistic pedagogy as compelled by the public policies in place with their youth-centered, justice-oriented, and civically engaged practice. And I'll stop on this diagram for just a second, because what we know is that the vast majority, in fact, all but 2 nations in the world have explicit policies that deal in arts education, that compel the pedagogy of our curriculum, instruction, and assessment. But what we found is that when deeply integrated with the practice, that youth-centered, justice-oriented, and civically engaged work, that young people have a better understanding of their self, their community, and the world. And in these 30 case studies across 24 nations, we found the same phenomena, that when young people experience this pedagogy practice hybrid, this graph became a flywheel, where those young people, artists, and educators were engaged with their communities to influence policy developments, not about education policy or about cultural practice or cultural funding, but about other issues like housing code, food security, the environment, and more. But what got in the way was these strict systems. Another thing we have to shift. The common story across all 30 cases was that there were young people and their adult allies who knew the benefits and outcomes of artistic, cultural, and creative learning, but were often impeded by gatekeepers who locked doors, the analogy that came up in every case study, through funding policy or limiting communities of practice, that really stopped in their tracks those strong practices and well-supported infrastructures that enabled their creative programs. So we purported a new theory of change, one that we could all get behind as a field, that we can focus on cultivating creative capabilities in youth, like creative thinking, cultural consciousness, connectivity, and citizenship, engage in acts of creative social transformation, which ultimately contribute to thriving communities and a more just world. The research that we conducted identified several ways in which programs were measuring that thriving community or more just world. Some were using youth development measures, other community development, or some even following the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But it begs the question, if the benefits and outcomes of artistic, cultural, and creative education are both a proven pathway for young people to be liberated, a fertile ground for social movements to cultivate creative expression and critical analysis, and they're also really documented as successful tactics for developing young people academically and otherwise, then why? Why does our field not have the language or the measurement of success to reflect the work for creative youth and their communities? And that leads me to the project that we did in 2020, in the heat of the pandemic, amidst the racial reckoning in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in the United States and other moments around the world, where we were commissioned to do a project through Art Place America. Art Place America was a 10-year, $10 million initiative funded by the largest cultural funders in the nation, seeking to understand the role of the arts in various elements of community development. On the left-hand side of their chart, you'll see the 10 different divisions of the community that they wanted to look at across the five sectors, that influence them. You'll notice one is youth development. However, it was the last and final one they did in their 10 years before sunsetting. And between all of us on this call, the research plan was approved on March 4th, 2020, and the world, in the United States at least, shut down on March 14th, 2020. So we did not, in fact, embed with programs, but instead, we revised a research methodology that empowered young creatives and their adult allies as the researchers and documentarians in their communities, seeking to ask the question or answer the question, what impact do young creatives have on their communities? We selected 9 case studies around the nation that focused on different elements of community development, like safety and belonging, or immigration, food, education reform, and mental health and well-being. These cases were absolutely fascinating. We looked at performing statistics in Richmond, Virginia, that worked through the visual arts with formerly incarcerated young people seeking to abolish youth prisons in the state. We talked to the folks at Cheyenne River Youth Project on the reservation in South Dakota, looking at food security and cultural continuity between generations of Native American tribes in the Sioux Nation. We talked to folks at One Hood Media that used music as a way of leading Black Lives Matter protests throughout Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We talked to the young people at Free Street Theater that made socially engaged theatrical performances about pollution and water security in Chicago. And lastly, we talked to Dancing Grounds, a program called Dance for Social Change. Young people who spent 2 years exploring the effects of gentrification and displacement in the wake of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, Louisiana. They hosted a site-specific dance festival called Reclaiming Our Home that put on performances aimed at the city's planning department, housing authority, and other agencies that resulted from the redlining, a racialized segregation tactic that was used in the United States history. I want to show you a video about the project of Dance for Social Change called Solastalgia that looks at the impact of gentrification and displacement in the city of New Orleans.
Beautiful city with a big part in tourism industry. City for sale, folks. Hot city. Come and get it, come and get it, come and get it. We can make space for you. We raise property values. We push out the locals. We push out the poor. We push out the black. Come and watch this new spectacle. We offer you the new minstrel. Beads, beignets, boudin, we have it all. Feast on savory gumbo, succulent spicy crawfish, jumping jambalaya. Feast on the culture, folks. City for sale, city for sale, city for sale, folks. Hot city, come and get it. Come and get it, come and get it, come and get it. It's like parades and succulents every day in New Orleans, folks. Space is limited. Move in now.
So as you can imagine, their performance did not happen on March 28th and 29th in 2020, but instead their work was amplified out. And that MC that you saw, her name's Akila. And I want to tell you a little bit about Akila. We worked with Akila as one of our youth researchers who documented the impact of their program in their community. She, with her adult ally, Coach Jess, went around the town to understand through the eyes of young people exactly the answer to this question. With her 8 other colleagues from the other case studies, they articulated many things about the impacts of their work. The first one, and you'll see Akila's quote here on the right, is about collaboration. She described this as saying, we could have gone it alone or together with my adult ally. And you see in the graph on the left, alone has minimal impact over time and together has some. She said, or we could have done it in community with others who share the same purpose. We went in community and began to see the change that we envisioned. What was described by our youth documentarians is that when we went in community, and they don't mean in the community, they mean in community with others, working together, their impact was exponential. In fact, they described that there were 3 dimensions of impact on the x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis. And you should have seen the creative artifacts that they supported here, using dance and visual art and music to describe this phenomena. These axes, though, directly align with the Gifts of the Muse report that came out in the early 2000s from the Wallace Foundation, describing the impact of the arts in community. But what these young people who'd never read that report described is that there was an experience impact, public or private, internal or with others. There was an outcomes impact, whether that be intrinsic or instrumental, one that advances you as a human internally, or instrumental to achieve other goals of other people. And one that had to deal with community, on people and on place. And when they described this, they talked about how there were these realms of impact that started with the creative process, where there was deep, deep, deep impact between young people and their adult allies, brought together by their creative process. But that resonated out as they created their projects. And it touched youth serving institutions, caregivers, families, schools, mentors, other artists that were involved. And ultimately, as they got to the point of sharing, as we tend to do in arts and culture, it brought in other community stakeholders, like community leaders or their friends or public agencies. In that one example I gave you from New Orleans, at their site-specific dance festival, they invited members of the city government, public officials that needed to hear their messages in order to change the policies they cared deeply about. And those sectors they worked in ranged from everything from leadership to well-being or education reform, the environment, immigration, and racial justice. And in the year 2020 in the United States, you can imagine these were all issues top of mind for young people and their communities. But lastly, they articulated these 8 outcomes that were the ultimate impact of their work, giving us new language and new measures of success in order to design future creative youth development programs. They described how their programs nourished creativity and cultivated agency in young people. They nurtured sustainable and responsive communities and built strong interpersonal and collective bonds. That was the top tier of bricks. But that's built on the foundation of enabling access to welcoming, safe, and healthy spaces, rethinking community, civic, and cultural institutions, and developing systems of collective decision-making, the foundation from which they build upon. But finally, there's the middle layer, and intentionally placed here is around fostering health, well-being, and belonging, and catalyzing intergenerational cultural continuity, the human aspects of our work. What we've actually found from young people is that they meld together many models as reported in our early 2019 research. It's not about just youth development or just community development or even the sustainable development put forward by the UN. In fact, young people see it a little bit differently. They're looking internal, external, for their benefit, for the benefit of others, and across communities and places. What they're actually describing are new metrics from which we can construct instruments of evaluation. We can influence future program design. And ultimately, what we can do is we can take their words and inform the work that we do, fully ceding power to young creatives within our communities, which, if you go back to the literature about community development, is the whole purpose. So when we talk about creative youth and community development, we have to think beyond the realm of our arts and cultural education programs that we think of, but instead really interrogate these dominant structures that move from protecting culture to acting civically. Instead of building barriers, we think about creating liberatory practices. And in the end, these young people say that we can achieve these 8 things, which ultimately contribute to those thriving communities and a more just world. Here are their words, actually crafted into a video by a group of young filmmakers from the Loop Lab in Boston, Massachusetts. So let's hear from these young people that we worked with in 2020.
To describe the program, it's a place where like youth and like not just youth, but teachers can come together and learn from each other.
This program truly values the voices of young people. It's not censored. We're taking what they're saying, their thoughts, their voices.
If we want to see us as a collective growing stronger by the day, we have to see ourselves as individuals grow stronger every day.
The team very adamant about like pausing the work to lean into like the relationships that are in the space.
With that creative expression, I think what we would see is happier people, happier communities.
So now comes my point of personal privilege. As we come to the close of the part where I'm talking at you and towards the part where we engage in a fruitful conversation, I want to give you all a challenge that we do something, and we do something now. Because in the story that I told you that began with my own upbringing as a young tap dancer at 2.5 years old, to the moment where the positionality of our work for me changed in 2018, to this research that was done in 2020, the world has actually changed dramatically. And that came with these ongoing pandemics. So from the end of 2020 through 2021, Creative Generation and our friends over at Wolf Brown, a consulting firm in the United States, conducted research to understand how the landscape around artistic, cultural, and creative education was changing. And following about 40 programs across the United States and another 14 around the world, we learned that there were 5 ongoing intersectional pandemics that really changed the way that we were doing our work. There was the global health crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, which was exacerbated by the social and political failures of our nations and our governments. There was racial violence in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and others that showed that there were slow responses and a lack of consequences for the vigilantes and the state who were disproportionately impacting the lives of BIPOC folks. There's economic inequality, the widening economic gap that resulted from a reliance on capitalism. And the political divisiveness. We all remember the impacts of our nationalistic and authoritarian political regimes, many of which are out of office now, but have long-lasting impact on the community strife and internal anxiety with politics. And lastly, the climate crisis, which results in the physical and mental stress caused by decades of neglect from our governments. Now, these don't seem inherently related to arts and cultural education at all. In fact, these are just global social challenges. However, young people and the creative programs that support them see it a different way. These programs were exponentially impacted and really were launched outside their comfort zone. In fact, we saw that in this diagram here, the phenomena from these programs that were studied was one that was both terrible and amazing. When programs were launched outside their comfort zone, that black dot in the middle, by the disruption from any of the number of those intersectional pandemics I just described, represented by that green resonating circle, they were launched into a zone of fear and uncertainty, where they didn't know what was going on. In fact, our research methodology called for weekly reports of the questions that people were asking themselves or their staffs at these programs. They were asking, when will we be able to open? Can we make payroll? Are people okay and safe and healthy? But from that, they gained some insight and learning, like perhaps we need to rethink the way that we communicate with our staffs, our families, and young people. Are there other methods of providing a social safety net? In the United States, the big question was around medical insurance. and they gained insights and learning. But this is actually where our sample diverged. About 41% chose what we called the short circuit scenario, where they fought tooth and nail to go back to their comfort zone, to do exactly what they always did. But the other 60 or so percent moved into what we call the opportunity scenario, where they harness those insights and learnings and actually change them into sustained opportunities, where they rethought those sticky, challenging problems that they never quite were able to deal with in their organizations. We saw organizations for the first time put young people on their boards of directors because the meetings weren't during school hours, because everyone was online. Or we saw people finally redo their payment structure to fund teaching artists in a reasonable fashion, or to provide health insurance for those who didn't have it. We also saw community programs fully embrace that notion of civic mindedness, where when they couldn't record music in small recording studios, they turned them into family-sized food pantries that allowed for people to get the food they needed during the pandemic in a safe and distanced way. The challenge that I offer everyone is that everything I shared before was happening in the pandemics. We saw young people being seen and heard like never before. They were able to capitalize on the movement from guaranteeing arts and cultural education as a right through public policy to the adoption of arts and cultural education as the catalyst for social change, as seen in the work of Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Our Future, or Malala Yousafzai and the poetry of education liberation, or the young people in the United States from A March for Our Lives. But further, we saw young people and their community programs embrace this notion of change and come full force to their decision makers, no longer just rebuking the language that I shared in 2019, but instead standing up and standing out for what they believed in. Here's one example from Mosaic Youth Theater in Detroit that shared their work in music and theater, music and dance and spoken word to address the intersectional challenges that they faced just in the city of Detroit. You'll note that the Flint water crisis was within their city limits, as well as the recording of this happening at the height of social distancing. It's called A State of Emergence.
I miss you. No hugs. Stay safe. I miss you. Stay safe.
This is not a drill.
We're in a state of emergency.
70 days, 4 extensions. Did I mention 94,000 plus just in Michigan?
This is a state of emergence.
See, we're 14% of the population, but 40% of those impacted. These are people. There are faces to these stats, and this is maddening. Is a state of emergency. Education's been upended. Schools closed, and the inner city ones don't have what's needed to address what history has cemented.
This is a state of emergence.
See, it's so much bigger than a digital divide. Meals, support systems, holistic wellness, and I can't even fully articulate what happens to one's spirit when nearly everything you love is taken away in an instant.
This is not a drill.
Can't embrace my family. Graduation ain't the same virtually. Paraded birthdays, Zoom memorials. My heart.
This is not a drill.
Tell me what I shouldn't grieve.
And I highly encourage you to view the full 8-minute piece that was created by the young people at Mosaic Youth Theater in Detroit. But I take their guidance as a charge for the artists and educators and community organization leaders that deal in the realm of creativity and education and culture. Because right now we're facing an unprecedented change, And what I hope we can learn from the last few years is that we can either harness that change to deal with the long-term structural barriers that have long inhibited arts and cultural learning, and instead build from them in order to catapult our sector as one of the leading supports for the next generation of change makers. This sounds a little frou-frou, a little up in the air, but what we've seen is over 200 cases throughout all of our research that give us the language, the design, and the metrics to do the work. So my closing thought is, let's get out of our own way. Let's adopt some of these new frameworks, heed the advice of young people, and to actually create the sector that they want, that they'll operate in as young creatives who are engaged in the development of their communities. So that's the talk that I hope to give today. I now invite my colleague and friend Michael Anderson to help guide us in some conversation. I myself am an educator and don't like talking at a screen. Would love to engage in some dialogue through any questions that you might have, clarifications, thoughts, add-ons, yes, ands. Please feel free to unmute, turn on your camera and chat, or drop a question in the chat, and we will certainly dialogue about it. Michael.
Thanks, Jeff. And what I've actually heard that presentation twice now, and you would think after hearing it once, I might go, oh yeah, well, you know, I've heard this all before, but just the explosion of ideas that is in just that one presentation, I think it takes 2 hearings, quite frankly. So much excitement and so much possibility bound up in that work. While people are just kind of either putting their hands up in the chat or putting a question in the box or whatever, I've just got a couple of questions that, well, a couple of observations, I think, and then a couple of questions. And then if other people want to throw in questions, they're welcome to do so. By the way, I'm Michael Anderson. I'm co-director of the Create Centre with Robin Ewing at the University of Sydney. And also in the chat, we've dropped in a link. So if you're new to the Create Centre and you'd like to see and hear more of this kind of excellent quality arts education discussion, we'd love to have you as a member. Membership's free. We've got a back catalogue of kind of amazing speakers, and Jeff will add to that back catalogue as we put his presentation up on YouTube. But back to what we're talking about today, I suppose the question that comes to me is those 5 crises, I think they're 5, was it 5 that we talked about? Mm-hmm. That none of them seem to be getting much better. So I suppose where is if we're thinking about the intersection of change, hope, and youth action, how do we ensure that people, A, don't think that that kind of creative social responses and young people are kind of not effective, but how do we keep people's hope up? How do we kind of ensure that people don't become, especially young people, don't become cynical, dissatisfied and disconnected from the process when they see, when they act, but they feel powerlessness. So I'm just wondering if you've got thoughts on how we maintain momentum, how we support young people to talk and engage, how we do all of those things.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I think those words that you threw out there, hope being an operative one, is what actually really resonates. Hope and possibility, I might pair with that. As we did do this particular project with these young people, because if you think about it, they're a generation that has faced many of these crises that previous generations only faced once or maybe one at a time. And coming from a generation that is always known as being apathetic, I find it particularly interesting to cop on to the hope and possibility that comes out of their responses. As we looked at these young people and they described their programs, one of the resonating themes was that they were ready to fight. that they knew it was going to be a fight and that they were in it for the long haul. I mean, you know all of the research that's out there about grit and perseverance that comes from the arts, and that's something that shone through in the work. The young people that I shared from Mosaic Youth Theater of Detroit are an interesting case because they're able to tackle such crazy challenges like poisoned water amidst the growing discourse where their governor was being threatened to be abducted by right-wing nationalists, alongside a global pandemic and social distancing, schools not being funded, and more. Yet they were able to carry their message forward in an intergenerational way. In fact, the voice singing when the young woman was dancing is that of their the alumni who took over the program and is now the executive director. Her name's DeLachey Strotter. So the hope that persists among young people for a possibility of a future is something that is incredibly inspiring. And what we've actually found is that young people find that the imagination and possibility that came up in that graph about applied creativity is ultimately really where it comes from. It's their arts training that strengthens that muscle of imagination and futures orientation. I fear that young people who don't have access to the arts lack that imagination and thus lack that hope that we talked about. So it's another argument in the case file for increased access for every young person.
Yeah, that's such a critical discussion, and it's a discussion that goes to why arts education and creativity education matter, I think. And we had Pam Bernard talking about that in our last seminar, but I think that when we grow tired of the fight, well, when this generation grows tired of the fight, I think we have to understand who's going to take up that fight next, or that I shouldn't use that kind of language, that cause next. Who is going to? And I think the answer is it's within the arts that enables people to have the skills to pursue arts education. So there's kind of a virtuous circle, I suppose, in that process. I can't see any questions in the chat, nor can I see any hands up. So I'm going to ask another question and be really greedy with your time. So given all of that, what's next? Like, what's next for you to answer your challenge yourself, you know, the challenge you put out to us? What are you doing with your organisations, which is pursuing the challenge that you made for us?
That's a tremendous question. And I wish you could have seen my mind mapping last weekend as we sought to answer that too in the reorganization of our website. You know, it's interesting. A little bit of the backstory about Creative Generation. Creative Generation, as I mentioned, is a values forward collective of artists, educators, researchers, administrators, storytellers, and activists that partner both with young creatives in their pursuit of social change, as well as, and primarily, with their adult allies and the organizations and institutions and systems who support them. And, you know, it was not an intentional choice. It was a research project that snowballed into a global organization. And there are some folks here on this call, two of whom I see, that have been involved in different projects in the past and currently that explore some big questions around the language and the vernacular that support our work, as well as the infrastructures of the organizations, the public policy recommendations, funding measures, and more. And what's really interesting is that in 2019, in the original research, what we refer to as the underpinning research of Creative Generation, where we established some of the vernacular and posed the big questions, we've actually answered those questions, and we know what it is. We've developed frameworks and models and have begun some hands-on implementation. In fact, we've worked with cohorts of schools around driving the change about integrated pedagogical measures. We've worked with different funding bodies and policymaking bodies in order to rethink through trust-based and transparent lenses how they're driving the change they wish to see. And we're amplifying those stories, hoping to build and and cultivate those capabilities in the decision makers, recognizing that we work within a broken, patriarchal, heteronormative capitalist societies that perpetuate the harms and continue to oppress people that seek the liberation, particularly through arts and cultural learning. But we also recognize that we do have the answers at the hyper local level, and it's often about scale. So the questions that we're asking for our next 5 years are around what it is that we want to do. Is it writing a book? Is it doing more hands-on projects? Or should we just continue, to tell those stories and fuel the infrastructures within the next generation and really actually seed that power? So it's an interesting question that I don't necessarily have the answer to, but know that, everything that is cited here is free and open resource, which is one of our major commitments, and that we hope that everyone here, the next time they talk to someone or teach a class or work with a group of young people, can either directly apply what they've learned or share some of those resources, be it a podcast, a white paper, a report, or a series of blogs, in order to help catalyze the conversation with their colleagues.
That's great, Jeff. Now, Rachel Jacobs, our colleague and friend, has asked a question. Do you want to unmute and ask it live, Rachel?
Yeah, sure. Jeff, thank you so much for the presentation. As always, it was inspiring, informative, thought-provoking, all the things. And I just found myself nodding along and things like that. And then further reflecting when Michael said, there's a whole range of things that you've mentioned that don't seem to be getting better. Is the answer not, youth are coming up with all these youth-led solutions and all this imagination and creativity that will show us a way, but for older people and adults just to stop being shit, like that's where the hope lies, surely, is that you're going to lose hope if every time you try to make a move or try to make an advancement, it is shut down by a whole lot of shit older people who just refuse to change or move or anything like that. Like I see, and Jeff, I missed part of your presentation, so I apologize. This might have been covered. Like I see the role of your research as in to tell those with power how to change and where to change, rather than it being, harking back to the old days of research with youth that was pretty patronizing in the past and things like that. I see your work as showing us a way that we can seed power and create change. Just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, 100%. So no, you did not. You're not asking a question about anything that you missed. I think it's a wonderful contribution, Rachel. In fact, we just released a new framework that's called equitable intergenerational collaboration that discusses exactly that, where we've often talked about youth-adult partnerships as part of power sharing or power seeding and cultivating youth in their development. But the model around equitable intergenerational collaborations certainly puts the onus actually on both older and younger. There's a model within it called cyclical mentorship that honors the knowledge of emerging mid-career and veteran leaders, adults, as well as young people sort of being at the core, and how we all have knowledges in order to exchange and ways of knowing in order to exchange, and that we are stronger when we work together. But there's a caveat to this equitable intergenerational collaboration, which is that first term, equitable. Those with disproportionate power have more responsibility in order to collaborate with each other. But what we know is that when those generations work together, particularly using creative or cultural means, they're able to actually do harder things, right? They're able to actually achieve broader objectives than what they ever would have imagined. And that actually speaks to Juliet's second question here in the chat about where do we start? And we start with the arts. That's actually the thing we know the best. It's the greatest entry point to social change making, be that in intergenerational collaboration, public policy reform, or any of the other social challenges that were discussed throughout the presentation. Is the arts are some of the greatest pathways in creating narrative and rewriting a vernacular so that we have a shared common language, to creating the very projects and building those relationships that we seek to drive change, and beyond that, to actually articulate the outcomes of what we want to see in the future. A lot of our research actually uses a pairing of both critical reflection, cite Brookfield and Donald Schoen and others, with educational futures frameworks like Sohail and Ayatollah's work and others that really actually look into the future and scaffold back the pathway that we can go. Doesn't that sound like how we write a script or put together a dance piece or scaffold symphonic music or work together to create a community mural? These are the skills that we have. So in fact, arts educators are sort of the superheroes with our code switching ability in both language, pedagogy, and program design. So I find it really interesting because the onus is actually on older people. And Rachel, not to cite you, but to do that, Rachel is actually one of the co-hosts of our podcast, which is called Why Change, which tells the stories of adults who are like upending those systems that get in our way and reimagining those systems, be they in program design, assessment and evaluation, funding, what have you, so that we can actually not be, to quote Rachel, those shit adults that are getting in the way. So I think I might have answered both questions in one, but Juliet, it is also lovely to see you. And I deeply, deeply respect your work as some of the earliest folks contributing to this research as well. I do see another hand up and another couple of questions in the chat. So Thomas, I think you might have been first. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, so I had a question about the role of the teaching artist working with young people, and I guess the tension between being a figure that facilitates their voice, the participant's voice, as opposed to making sure that they, say things in a way that is, kind of optimized for an audience reception. I'm not sort of talking about of teaching artists trying to get their own point of view across, as opposed to just being a figure in the room that, by virtue of what they're there to do, has an impact on the curation of the arts project in the end. And there's a tension there which I straddle in my work as a teaching artist, and it's something that I think about very deeply. There's always a point in the week of a workshop where you're like, we've actually got to make some decisions here, guys, and someone has to do that. So I was just wondering if you could reflect a bit on that and what, and maybe you don't see that tension, maybe that's just part of the process, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I certainly see that tension. In fact, I'll cite my colleague Katie Rainey, who's a teaching artist and actually wrote one beautifully about that on one of our blogs in a series about holding tension. And it basically was describing the difference between like getting the thing done and, embodying all of these values, these virtues that we hold in our creative practice as well as certain things, right? Like as a facilitator, you need guardrails so that young people don't unintentionally harm themselves or others and things of that nature, right? But the operative thing that I'm going to do and sort of hijack your question to talk about is about holding tension. So we actually conducted a very large research project on behalf of the World Alliance for Arts Education, looking at the qualities and aptitudes of leaders in arts and cultural education. And actually what we found is that the desire of the field is actually to move away from a singular leader and move towards a notion of distributed collective leadership, where folks like teaching artists have equalized power with executive directors and program leaders and things of that nature. But in order to do so, there were 4 inquiry-based processes, another arts-based term, right, that actually emerged as a pathway to get to this notion of distributed collective leadership, where teaching artists are able to do the thing that they do best. And one of those is holding tension. And it follows bridging and navigating and unlearning things. But that notion of holding tension is the recognition that at our very core in arts education spaces, we hold the tension between arts and education. Sometimes we must focus on the youth development or academic achievement. Other times we must focus on the artistic practice and cultural preservation. What does it mean to tell a young person that you may invent anything that you would like, but also recognize the cultural heritage that may come with a certain article of clothing, for example, a headdress in Native American cultures? And so how are we able to hold those tensions and navigate that without leading to burnout or exiting the field in its most dire circumstance? And that tension is actually something that is vital in our work. So I would argue that teaching artists, personal superheroes of mine, hold tensions wonderfully, where they speak education and arts. They speak in school and out of school. They speak all the languages in order to bridge those tensions and navigate that space. So I don't think I exactly answered your question. I think that's sort of like a thesis question that we could work on for a couple of years. But I think that there's a start in the recognition of the ability to hold tension and that the operation in that sort of gray area as being a natural component of what it means to do this type of work.
Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, our time's rapidly running to a close. Is there anyone else who's got a question? Jeff,
I think there might be a question from Natasha.
Tash,
Michael,
go for it.
Hi, yeah, won't keep you long. I guess my biggest question is, I mean, I do see a lot of young people doing theatre and dance, which is really, really lovely here in Brisbane. Has there been any research or what's happening for Australian audiences? It looks like a lot of the changed, what's happening in the world is like happening worldwide, very much so, like with health crisis and all the different 5 things that he mentioned on. Has there been any studies, or what are you finding that's coming out in Australia at the moment? Is there anything that's been done or that you're finding that of any programs that, like, again, the program that Jeff has done sounds amazing. Like, I loved every bit of it. So I just wonder if there's anything like that talked about here in Australia. I mean, we've got a new arts minister, I guess, on a federal level. So I just wonder if he's aware of this kind of stuff. I don't know who can answer that.
I will certainly defer to my Australian colleagues. I will note that within that leadership study, actually, thanks to Rachel and our other colleagues across the country, there was a focus group that was held as part of that across Australia. So I know from that, there's a number of people that are doing incredible work at these intersections. And there's regularly folks, I think there's actually a similar namesake organization called Creative Generation.
There is actually, yeah.
that does some great work, but I will defer to my colleagues, but know that the rest of the world also is looking to Australia as some of the leading folks in this space from my perspective. So if others have examples, I would definitely encourage those to be shared.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a good amount of research that sits in the same space. It doesn't always look the same as the American research, but happy if you drop me a line to put you onto some studies, if you let me know what exactly you're looking for, Natasha.
Yeah.
Sorry for shortening your name.
No, that's all right. No, that's okay. That's all right. I was going to do some research anyway, so that's fine. No, thank you, Michael.
No worries. All right, everyone. I think that might work as our last word. Thanks so much, Jeff. It was so provocative, so interesting, so exciting to hear the work that's going on with Creative Generation. I'm really looking forward to catching up with this work and keeping our membership apprised of the things that you're doing and helping in any way we can from Create's perspective to really kind of make kind of strength to your arm, really, because what you're doing is world leading, and we are just so grateful that you've been able to share that with us today, Jeff.
Well, thank you so much. Those are very kind words, and it was a real honor spending time in community with you all. Thanks so much for having me, and enjoy the rest of your day. As you can see, the sun has set while we've been on this call. So I will catch you all next time, and hopefully continue to see you around these spaces of shared knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.